The heart monitor beside my bed flatlined into a long, flat scream for 3 full seconds before a nurse's palm slammed the code button, and the whole time, my son was sitting in a valet line outside his father-in-law's country club, tipping the attendant $20 to park his car up front. I didn't die that night, but something in me did, and by morning I had made a decision that would end with a man in handcuffs and a family in ruins, and I regret none of it. If you've ever been the parent who raised a child alone at 2 a.m. with a fever thermometer in one hand and a work boot in the other, only to watch that child choose someone else's family over yours when it mattered most, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. Tell me in the comments what city you're listening from tonight. I read every single one of them. And tonight, more than most nights, I need to know I'm not telling this to an empty room. My name is Harlan Voss. I am 71 years old, and for 43 years I ran an ironworks on the Ellison Sound waterfront, the kind of business that doesn't exist much anymore. We forged ship fittings, repaired hulls, built the swing span of the Ellison Bridge with our own hands in 1987, back when the town council said it couldn't be done without a contractor from out of state. My name is stamped into a bronze plaque bolted to that bridge. My hands built half the working waterfront that tourists photograph now and call charming. But this isn't a story about a bridge. This is a story about the night my only son left me alone in a hospital bed to attend a party, and the 12 days that followed, 12 days in which I let everyone in my family believe I had finally, quietly, begun to lose my mind. I hadn't lost anything. I had just started paying attention. It started on a Tuesday evening in October, the kind of evening where the light off the Sound turns the color of weak tea and the shrimp boats come in early because a front is moving through. I was in my workshop, the one attached to the house, running a bead of weld on a hinge for the old chapel gate down on Front Street, a job I did every year for free because Colleen, my wife, used to teach Sunday school there before the cancer took her 11 years ago. I felt a tightness climb up my left arm like a rope pulling taut. I sat down on my work stool. I remember thinking very clearly and very calmly, the way you think about weather, that this was probably a heart attack and that I should probably call someone before I lost the ability to dial a phone. I called Derek, my son, 44 years old, an insurance adjuster, married 8 years to a woman named Vanessa Callum, whose father, Roger Callum, owns roughly a third of the waterfront real estate in this town, including, as it turns out, several parcels he does not actually own yet, but very badly wants to. Derek picked up on the fourth ring. I could hear music behind him, the tinny sound of a string quartet trying to be heard over clinking glasses. "Dad, can I call you back?" "We're at the Callum's anniversary thing. It's a whole production." "Derek," I said, and something in my voice must have carried, because the music behind him got quieter, like he'd stepped outside. "I think I'm having a heart attack." There was a pause, not a long one, maybe 2 seconds. But I have run a business for 4 decades, and I know the sound of a man doing math in his head, weighing one obligation against another. "Okay," he said. "Okay, call 911. I'm coming. Just call 911 first, Dad. Don't wait for me." He did come. I'll give him that much, because if I don't, this story becomes simpler than it actually was, and simple stories are usually lies. He met the ambulance at the emergency room doors of Ellison Regional, and he stood next to my gurney, while a doctor half his age told him my left anterior descending artery was 80% blocked, and I needed a stent placed that night. He signed the consent forms because my hands were shaking too hard to hold the pen steady. He held my hand for maybe 4 minutes while they prepped me. And then his phone buzzed, and I watched his face do something I recognized from 30 years of watching him decide things. Vanessa was calling. Her father was about to give a toast. The whole extended Callum family, half the town's money, was gathered under one roof, and Derek Voss, son of a dead-broke widower ironworker, had married into it 8 years ago and had spent every day since terrified that someone would remember where he came from. "Dad," he said, "they're doing the stent right now. You're in the best hands. I'm gonna run back for like an hour, just for the toast, and I'll be back before you're even out of recovery." I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer anyone at 71. I did not feel rage. Rage would come later, and it would come cold and useful, not hot and useless. What I felt, lying on that gurney with a nurse shaving a patch of skin near my groin for the catheter, was a very old, very familiar loneliness, the kind that had been living in my chest since Colleen died and had just been waiting for an excuse to remind me it was still there. Go, I told him. Go to your party. He went. The procedure took 90 minutes. I don't remember most of it, they sedate you for the worst part, but I remember waking in a recovery bay with a nurse checking the pressure bandage on my wrist, and I remember asking her, in a voice still thick from the sedative, what time it was. Just past 10, she said. Derek did not come back at 10. He did not come back at 11. The nurse who stayed with me the longest, a woman named Angela Cho, who I would come to know very well over the following days, moved me up to a cardiac step-down unit around midnight, and when she asked if I had anyone coming to sit with me overnight, I told her the truth. I didn't know. I texted Derek at 12:40 a.m., just checking in. All good here. He wrote back at 1:15 a.m., a single line that I have not deleted from my phone, that I look at sometimes to remind myself why I did what I did next. Party ran long. Rog wanted to talk business. Staying at their place tonight. See you tomorrow. Glad you're okay, old man. Old man. He'd never called me that before. I noticed it the way you notice a hairline crack in a weld before it fails. A small thing that tells you everything about the stress underneath. Angela Cho found me still awake at 2 in the morning, sitting up in bed with the lights off, staring at the parking lot through the window. She was maybe 35, sharp-eyed, the kind of nurse who'd clearly buried her own share of grief and come out the other side more tender for it rather than less. She didn't ask if I was all right, because she could see I wasn't, and she'd clearly learned a long time ago that the question insults people more than it helps them. You want some company? She asked instead. I've got a med pass in 20 minutes, but I've got 20 minutes. She sat in the vinyl chair by my bed and she talked to me about nothing in particular, her dog. A rescue mutt named Biscuit, a garden she was trying to grow tomatoes in that kept getting raided by deer, and somewhere in the middle of that small, kind, unimportant conversation, my chest stopped feeling quite so hollow. I want you to remember Angela Cho. She matters more to this story than almost anyone in it, and she is not related to me by one drop of blood. It was around 2:40 a.m. when the second thing happened, the thing that actually started this story moving. My hospital room shared a thin wall with a small consultation alcove where the nursing staff sometimes took phone calls they didn't want echoing down the hallway. I heard a voice through that wall, low, urgent, unmistakably my son's, and I heard him say a name that made every hair on my arms stand up. Roger. I want to be clear that I was not trying to eavesdrop. A man recovering from a stent placement, alone at 3 in the morning, hears everything that happens within 20 feet of him, because there is nothing else to occupy his mind. Derek must have come back to the hospital sometime after 1, checked on me while I was finally asleep from the sedative, and then stepped into that alcove to take a call he thought no one could hear. He's stable, Derek said. Yeah, they said the artery thing, whatever, he's fine. Look, I'm just saying, this is going to freak him out more than the actual heart attack did, if we bring it up now, right after. Can we just wait a few weeks? A pause. I couldn't hear the other end. I know Marchetti needs the site plan filed by the 15th. I know that, Roger. I'm not saying we don't do it. I'm saying maybe we ease into the guardianship conversation instead of walking in with paperwork the day after his heart attack. That's all I'm saying. Guardianship. I lay very still in that dark room with a bandage over the artery that had nearly killed me hours earlier, and I listened to my only son discuss, in the hallway outside my hospital room, the legal process by which a court strips a man of the right to make decisions about his own life, his own money, his own land. Fine, Derek said. Fine. I'll tell him Dr. Reyes wants to run some cognitive screening while he's already admitted. That's not even a lie, technically. It's a routine thing after cardiac events. Nobody's going to question it. Just give it a week before the Callum Coastal guys start talking to me about the Ironworks parcel, okay? I need him relaxed. I need him trusting me. The line went dead, or he hung up. or he walked away. I don't know which. I lay in that bed until the gray light started coming up over the parking lot, and I thought about the 11 acres of waterfront that had been in my family since 1962, the ironworks my father built with a war penchant and stubbornness, the land Colleen and I had raised Derek on, the land that had a bronze plaque with my name on a bridge that crossed right through the middle of it. I thought about the word guardianship, and I thought about the word Marchetti, and I thought about the fact that my son, sitting 4 feet away from my hospital bed 12 hours earlier, had let me sign consent forms with a shaking hand while he was already quietly discussing how to take my legal capacity away from me. By 6 in the morning, when Angela Cho came in to check my vitals for the shift change, I had made my decision, and it was this. Nobody in my family was going to know that I knew anything at all. "Mr. Voss," she said, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around my arm, "you look like a man who didn't sleep. Didn't sleep a wink," I told her, and that part, at least, was true. She looked at me a moment longer than the reading required. Nurses develop an instinct for the difference between a man in physical pain and a man carrying something heavier, and I think Angela Cho had that instinct sharper than most. "You want to talk about it?" I almost told her right then. I almost told a stranger in scrubs the entire ugly shape of what I'd overheard, because I had no one else in the world at 6 a.m. who I trusted with it, but I held my tongue because I had learned one thing in 43 years of running a shop full of men who'd rather lose a finger than admit a mistake. You don't hand anyone a weapon before you know which way they're pointed. I didn't know Angela Cho yet. Not really. Not the way I would come to. "I'm fine," I said. "Just an old man thinking about his son." Derek came back to the hospital at 9 that morning, freshly showered, wearing a golf shirt that still had the fold creases in it from the store, carrying a coffee for himself and nothing for me. He sat in the chair Angela had occupied hours earlier, and he told me, in a voice pitched exactly the way you'd pitch it if you were easing a frightened animal toward a trap, that Dr. Reyes wanted to run a few cognitive screening tests before discharge. Just standard after a cardiac event, nothing to worry about. "Sure," I said, "whatever the doctor thinks is best. I want you to sit with that line for a second, because it is the first lie I told in this story, and it was far from the last. I did not believe it was nothing to worry about. I believed, with the cold clarity of a man who had just heard his son plan a legal ambush against him through a hospital wall, that this cognitive screening was the opening move in a campaign to have me declared incompetent, and that the campaign had a deadline because somewhere in this town a man named Marchetti needed a site plan filed by the 15th, and my 11 acres of waterfront were standing in his way. I decided, lying in that bed with a coffeeless morning, and a son performing gentleness at me like it was a job interview, that if my family wanted to believe I was slipping, I was going to give them the performance of my life. And underneath that performance, while they measured my memory with flashcards and stopwatches, I was going to find out exactly how deep this went, and exactly who Marchetti was, and exactly what my son-in-law's father thought my land was worth to him. They wheeled in a woman named Dr. Priya Anand around 11 that morning, a neuropsychologist, pleasant, thorough, clearly not part of whatever scheme was unfolding, just a professional doing a professional's job at the request of a family that had asked for it. She asked me to remember 3 words: apple, table, penny. She asked me to draw a clock face and mark the hands at 10 past 11. She asked me who the president was, and I told her correctly, and I watched her write something down, and I thought about how easy it would have been for a different kind of doctor, a bought doctor, a doctor with a financial interest in a marina development, to write down something else entirely regardless of what I actually said. I passed. Of course I passed. My mind was sharper that morning than it had been in years, honed by fear and fury into something with an edge on it, but I filed away, very carefully, exactly how a genuine cognitive test looked and sounded, because I suspected I was about to see a fraudulent version of one somewhere down the road, and I wanted to know the difference when I saw it. Derek drove me home 2 days later. He was solicitous in the car, asking if I was warm enough, if I wanted the radio on, if I needed him to stop for anything. He walked me into the house and made a show of checking that the stove was off and the doors were locked, the kind of care that would have moved me to tears 3 days earlier, and now made my stomach turn, because I understood it wasn't care. It was inventory. He was a man walking through a property he already considered, in some quiet compartment of his mind, to be halfway his. "I want you staying with me and Vanessa for a few weeks," he said, standing in my kitchen. In the kitchen where Colleen used to bake bread every Sunday, just until you're back on your feet. "It's not safe for you out here alone." "I've got the ironworks 50 feet from my back door, Derek," I said. "I've been alone out here for 11 years. That was before the heart attack, Dad." I looked at my son, this man I had taught to weld before he could drive. This man whose mother had died in a hospice bed in the room down the hall, while he sat holding her hand and mine at the same time, and I made myself smile, the smile of a tired, grateful, slightly confused old man. "Maybe you're right," I said. "Maybe I could use the company for a bit." I watched something in his shoulders relax, a tension I hadn't even fully registered until it left him, and I understood in that moment that whatever came next, whatever guardianship paperwork and whatever man named Marchetti and whatever plans Roger Callum had for my 11 acres, my son wanted it to go easily. He didn't want a fight. He wanted a father who slid quietly into confusion and cooperation, who signed what was put in front of him, who thanked everyone for taking such good care of him. I decided I would give him exactly that son, right up until the moment I didn't. That night, alone in my own house for one last evening before I was set to move into Derek and Vanessa's guest room the following morning, I walked out to the ironworks in the dark. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I knew that shop by feel, by the smell of scorched metal and cutting oil that had soaked into the concrete floor over 4 decades. I found my way to the back office, the small room where I kept the books before we went digital, the room with the old iron safe, bolted into the floor, that Colleen used to joke looked like something out of a Western. I opened it. Inside, along with the deed to the 11 acres and my father's discharge papers from the Merchant Marine and Colleen's grandmother's wedding ring, was a small brass compass she had given me on our 20th anniversary, inscribed on the underside with 4 words: "You always find your way back." I sat on the cold concrete floor of the shop my father built, holding a dead woman's compass, and I thought about a very simple fact. I had spent 43 years building things strong enough to survive storms, hurricanes, decades of salt air, the occasional careless boat captain who misjudged the swing bridge clearance. I knew how to build things that held. And somewhere in the last 24 hours, I had realized that the thing I had built with the least skill, the least attention, the thing that was now buckling under its very first real storm, was my own family. I put the compass in my shirt pocket, where it would stay for the next 12 days, a small hard weight against my chest, reminding me of exactly who I was. No matter how confused I pretended to be in front of the people I loved most and trusted least. The next morning, I packed a single bag, put on the most tired, most grateful expression I could manage, and let my son drive me into the heart of the trap. He didn't yet know I could see clearly. Vanessa met us at the door of their house with the particular brightness people reserve for situations they feel slightly guilty about. A hug that lasted exactly as long as a hug should, and not 1 second longer. A guest room already made up with fresh towels folded into triangles on the bed like a hotel. She was a handsome woman, my daughter-in-law, sharp-featured, quick to laugh at things that weren't especially funny when her father was in the room, and in 8 years of marriage to my son, I had never once seen her raise her voice to him or to anyone, which I had mistaken foolishly for gentleness rather than what it actually was, caution around money she hadn't earned and didn't want to lose. "We want you comfortable, Harlan," she said, steering me toward the guest room with a hand hovering an inch behind my elbow, the way you'd guide someone you expected to stumble. "Anything you need." I need to know what my land is worth to your father, I thought. I need to know his name, Marchetti. I need to know how deep this goes and how many of you are in on it. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said instead. "This is very kind." The first 3 days at Derek and Vanessa's house were an education in exactly how thoroughly a family can dress cruelty up as concern. My blood pressure was checked morning and night by Vanessa, who had, she informed me cheerfully, taken a nursing assistant course years ago before switching to marketing. My medications were laid out for me each morning in a plastic organizer, with the days of the week printed on it, as though I hadn't managed my own heart medication perfectly well for 11 years since Colleen's illness had first taught me how. I was asked, repeatedly, gently, whether I remembered things, whether I'd eaten, whether I knew what day it was. I played the part. God help me, I played it well. I let a bead of confusion cross my face when Vanessa asked me what I'd had for breakfast, even though I remembered perfectly. 2 eggs and the last of the sourdough Angela Cho had strangely and kindly dropped off at the hospital the day I was discharged. A small paper bag with a note that said, "For the man who didn't sleep a wink." I let my hand shake slightly when Derek handed me the newspaper, though my hands hadn't shaken from anything but rage in 3 days. I nodded along vaguely when Vanessa's mother, Deborah Callum, stopped by on the second afternoon and spoke to me the way you'd speak to a large, slow dog, loudly, with lots of pauses, as though volume might substitute for patience, and I watched. God, did I watch. On the 4th day, I found the first piece of the drip that would become a flood. I had asked, with the mild confusion of a man who no longer trusted his own memory, whether anyone had checked my mail at the house. Derek said he'd take care of it, and I noticed, the way you notice a burr in a weld before it splits, that he did not say he'd bring it to me. 2 days later I asked again, this time framing it as worry about a prescription refill notice I was expecting, and Vanessa told me, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that she'd already had it forwarded to their address for convenience since I was staying with them now. Mail redirection, filed with the post office. On a man who had been out of his own house for 4 days. On the 6th day, Roger Callum came to dinner. I had met Roger perhaps a dozen times over 8 years, always at some family event, weddings, the christening of Derek and Vanessa's dog, the kind of gathering where he'd shake my hand with exactly the right amount of pressure and ask me exactly one polite question about the ironworks before turning his attention to someone whose net worth interested him more. He was 63, silver-haired, expensively casual in the way that only money that's been comfortable for 2 generations can afford to look, and he had built Callum Coastal Group into the largest private landholder on this stretch of the Sound by buying low from people who didn't know what their land would be worth in 10 years, and selling high to people who did. He arrived that evening with a bottle of wine and a leather portfolio, and I understood, watching him set that portfolio on the sideboard, with the deliberate casualness of a man who wanted it to look like an afterthought, that this was not a social visit. Dinner was pleasant. Roger asked me how I was feeling, told a long story about his own father's bypass surgery 20 years ago, poured wine for everyone but me, since I was on blood thinners, a fact he mentioned to the table as though it were evidence of how closely he was watching out for my welfare. I ate my chicken, and I nodded along, and I said very little, because a confused old man says very little, and I let the conversation drift, as I knew it would, toward the future. "You know, Harlan," Roger said, setting down his fork with the air of a man arriving at a topic he'd been circling all evening, "I've been thinking about that stretch of waterfront your family's held onto all these years. 11 acres, right on the Sound. That's about the last undeveloped commercial parcel between the marina and the bridge. Whole town's grown up around it. My father built that shop with his own hands," I said, which was true, and which I said in the mild, wandering tone of a man telling a story he'd told 100 times before and had lost track of the point of. 1962. Poured the slab himself. "That's a hell of a legacy," Roger said, and I heard, underneath the warmth in his voice, the particular flatness of a man who considers legacy a sentiment rather than a fact, something soft that gets in the way of things that are hard and real, like zoning approvals and construction loans. But at some point, a legacy's got to make room for the next generation, doesn't it? I've got a group of investors, real serious people, ready to put together something special right there. Mixed use, residential, a proper marina with slips for 60 boats. It'd bring more jobs to this town in 18 months than that old shop's brought in the last 18 years. I let my eyes drift toward the window, toward nothing, the way a mind that's wandering does. Colleen loved that view, I said, which was also true, and also entirely beside whatever point Roger was building toward. I watched Derek and Vanessa exchange a look across the table, a small, private, satisfied look, and I understood in that moment, with a certainty that settled into my chest like a stone dropping to the bottom of a well, exactly what they believed was happening to me. They believed the old man was fading. They believed the fog was rolling in exactly on schedule, exactly the way Dr. Reyes's cognitive screening comment had been meant to set up, exactly the way a routine competency evaluation would soon confirm on paper. They believed I would nod and drift and eventually sign whatever kind, patient, well-dressed document was placed in front of me because I trusted my son and because I no longer had the sharpness to know better. Roger reached for the leather portfolio. "I don't want to push you tonight, Harlan," he said in the voice of a man about to push very hard indeed. "But I did have my attorney draw up a preliminary letter of intent, just so you'd have something to look at whenever you're ready. No pressure at all. Derek and Vanessa can walk you through it whenever it's convenient." He set the portfolio on the table in front of me. I looked down at it the way a confused old man might look at a foreign object, and then I looked up at Roger Callum, and I let a small, grateful, slightly bewildered smile cross my face. "That's very thoughtful of you, Roger," I said. "I'll take a look." I did not open that portfolio at the table. I carried it to the guest room that night, and I closed the door, and I sat on the edge of the bed with the little brass compass in my shirt pocket pressing against my chest. And I opened it by the light of my phone with hands that, for the first time in 6 days, I let shake for real. The letter of intent named a purchase price for the 11 acres, 40% below what I knew. From 4 decades of watching waterfront values in this town, the land was actually worth. It was structured to route through something called the Voss Family Legacy Trust, an entity I had never heard of and never signed papers to create, with Derek Voss listed as trustee. Underneath the letter of intent, stapled at the back where a hurried, arrogant man might not expect anyone confused enough to look, was a second document. A petition for the appointment of a guardian, drafted, dated 3 days earlier, listing Derek Voss as petitioner, requesting emergency temporary authority pending a full competency hearing, citing a recent cardiac event and observed cognitive decline consistent with early-stage vascular dementia. Vascular dementia, a diagnosis I did not have, had never been given by any doctor, real or otherwise, written into a legal petition as though it were already fact. I sat on that bed for a long time. I thought about the plaque on the bridge with my name on it. I thought about Colleen teaching Sunday school at that little chapel 2 blocks from the ironworks. I thought about my father pouring that concrete slab in 1962 with a war pension and nothing else, betting everything he had on 11 acres of scrub pine and mudflat because he believed correctly that this town was going to grow up around a working waterfront. I thought about the fact that in 6 days, my own son had let a doctor write words into a document that weren't true, had let a stranger's attorney draft a petition to strip me of the right to make my own decisions, all so that his father-in-law's company could route around a construction loan deadline and build condominiums where my father's shop stood. I did not cry. I want to tell you that, because I think it matters. I have cried exactly twice in the last 11 years. Once at Colleen's funeral and once privately in the ironworks office, the night I finished the last project she ever saw me start. I did not cry that night in Derek's guest room. What I felt instead was something colder and far more useful, the same feeling I used to get in the shop when a weld failed under load, and I had to figure out calmly, methodically, exactly where the metal had been weak, and exactly how to reinforce it before it failed again and took someone's hand with it. I photographed every page of that letter of intent and that guardianship petition with my phone. I photographed the attorney's letterhead, a firm I didn't recognize, and the notary stamp on the physician's declaration attached at the very back, signed not by Dr. Reyes, the perfectly reasonable neuropsychologist who had tested me at the hospital and found nothing wrong, but by a name I had never heard, a Dr. Franklin Voss. No relation, presumably, just a coincidence of surname that made my stomach turn regardless. a physician whose declaration described symptoms I did not have, based, the document claimed, on family collateral reporting and clinical presentation observed during a home visit that had never happened, because I had been in Derek and Vanessa's guest house for 6 days, and no doctor named Franklin Voss had ever once darkened that door. I put the portfolio back exactly as I'd found it, corners aligned, and I placed it on the dresser where Derek could retrieve it in the morning, and I lay awake until nearly dawn, with the compass in my fist, thinking about the word forgery, and thinking about the fact that a forged physician's declaration was not the sloppy carelessness of a desperate man. It was the calculated confidence of a man who had done this before, or who had at least been advised by someone who understood exactly how thin the line was between an elderly man's family expressing concern and an elderly man's family committing fraud, and had decided the reward was worth the risk. I needed help. I needed people who understood medicine and law and the particular local politics of a town where the Callum family's money touched half the institutions in it. And I needed people Derek and Roger Callum would never in 1,000 years suspect I still had. The next morning, over coffee, I let myself pretend to have trouble pouring. I asked Vanessa, with the mild, apologetic uncertainty of a man losing his grip on his own routine, if someone could drive me by the ironworks. Just to check on things, I told her, just to feel useful for an hour. I let my voice catch slightly on the word useful, and I watched her face soften with exactly the kind of pity that makes people careless. "Of course, Harlan," she said. "I'll have Derek take you this afternoon." Derek dropped me at the shop at 2 o'clock and told me he had a meeting. He'd be back in 2 hours. Don't touch anything heavy. Call if I needed him. I told him I'd just be pottering, sorting through old paperwork, the kind of harmless activity a fading old man might occupy himself with. I watched his car pull out of the gravel lot and turn onto Front Street, and I stood alone for a moment in the shop my father built, breathing in cutting oil and rust and 60 years of family history. And then I walked to the wall phone in the back office, the same rotary-style landline I'd kept for decades, because cell service was spotty this close to the water, and I dialed a number I still knew by heart. "Ellison Regional. Cardiac step-down, this is Angela, I said. "It's Harlan Voss, the old man who didn't sleep a wink." There was a pause, and then I heard something in her voice shift, warm and immediate. "Mr. Voss, are you all right?" "You sound different. I need your help," I said. "And I need you to understand something before I ask for it. I am not confused. I have not been confused for one single day since the night my son left me in that hospital. Everyone around me believes I'm losing my mind, and I have let them believe it because I needed the time to find something out. And now I've found it, and it's worse than I was afraid of, and I don't have anyone left in this town I trust enough to ask for help except a nurse who brought me sourdough bread for no reason at all." Silence on the line for 3 full seconds. Then, "What do you need, Mr. Voss?" "I need to know if a physician named Franklin Voss actually practices anywhere near here, and I need someone who understands how a guardianship petition works, and I need it fast, because I think I have about a week before my son files paperwork asking a judge to take my life away from me on paper." Angela Cho did not hesitate. "I get off shift at 7, she said. "I'm bringing my uncle." I didn't know. That afternoon, standing in my father's shop with a dead phone line humming in my ear, that Angela Cho's uncle was a retired elder law attorney named Marcus Cho, who had spent 30 years representing exactly the kind of vulnerable elderly clients that predatory families like to target, and that within 72 hours I would be sitting in a back booth of a dock workers' bar called the Anchor Room with 3 people who had no blood relation to me whatsoever, and who would end up caring more about what happened to me than my own son had in a decade. But that's getting ahead of the story. That afternoon I hung up the phone and I walked out into the shop floor, and I stood beneath the old ship's bell my father had salvaged from a scrapped Liberty ship in 1968 and hung from the rafters. The bell we used to ring at the end of every shift for 40 years until arthritis in my shoulder finally made me stop swinging the rope myself. I reached up, slow and deliberate, and I rang it once, a single long note that rolled out over the mudflats, and the sound beyond, the same sound my father used to make when a job was finished, right? I wasn't finished. Not even close. But something had started, and I wanted, for one private moment, before the fighting began in earnest, to mark it the way my father would have. Derek came back for me at 4, exactly as promised, and found me sitting quietly at the old desk, papers spread in front of me, playing the part of a man sorting through memories he barely recognized. He smiled at me with real, uncomplicated warmth, the kind of smile I hadn't seen from him in 8 years, since before Vanessa, since before the Callums, since before he'd learned to weigh me against something shinier. "Good day, Dad?" he asked. "Good day," I told him, and for once that wasn't even a lie. The anchor room sits at the end of a pier that's been condemned twice and rebuilt twice, a bar with a plank floor that still smells faintly of diesel, and a jukebox that hasn't been updated since Reagan was president. I had not set foot in it in 3 years, not since the last time I'd sat there with 2 of my oldest friends and toasted a job well done. Angela Cho picked me up that evening in her own car, telling Derek and Vanessa, with the easy confidence of a professional, that she wanted to do a home follow-up visit as a courtesy, since I'd been her patient, and that she'd bring me back within a couple of hours. Derek didn't question it. Why would he? A nurse offering free follow-up care was exactly the kind of thing that fit the story he'd already decided to believe about his fading father. She drove me not to my house, but to the anchor room, and when we walked in, I found 3 people waiting in the back booth, and my chest did something it hadn't done in 11 years, something between grief and gratitude, because 2 of the 3 faces I recognized, and I had not expected to see either of them again outside of a funeral, mine or theirs. The first was Ray Odom, 74 years old, 31 years on the Ellison Sound Police Force, the last 11 of them as captain, retired now but still built like a man who could put a hand on your shoulder and end an argument without raising his voice. Ray had been my foreman's best friend 40 years ago, back when we were all young enough to think the work would never break our backs, and he'd stood beside me at Colleen's funeral in his dress uniform, an honor he hadn't been obligated to give a civilian's wife, but had given anyway, because that's who Ray was. The second was Dr. Sullivan Whitfield, called Doc Sully by everyone who'd ever known him, 79 years old, the physician who had delivered Derek in 1980, and had treated half the working waterfront for free or for barter for 3 decades before he finally retired. Doc Sully had a mind for medicine sharper than most doctors, half his age still practicing, and a low, quiet fury about medical fraud that I would come to learn burned even hotter than my own, because he had spent his career watching what happened to elderly patients when families and predatory professionals worked together against their interests. The third face, the one I didn't know yet, belonged to Marcus Cho, Angela's uncle, 68, a compact, precise man with reading glasses, pushed up onto a bald head, and the particular stillness of someone who has spent 30 years in courtrooms, learning that the person who talks least usually wins most. He had a legal pad in front of him already covered in notes, though we hadn't yet exchanged a single word. "Harlan Voss," Ray Odom said, standing to shake my hand with a grip that hadn't softened one bit in 3 years. "Heard you had yourself a heart attack in a family emergency in the same week. Hell of a week." "Heard right," I said, sliding into the booth. Angela sat beside her uncle, and I noticed the 2 of them exchanged a look, an easy, familial shorthand, and I understood I had stumbled, through nothing but a stranger's kindness in a hospital room, into exactly the kind of found family a man needs when his real one turns predatory. I told them everything. The overheard phone call through the hospital wall, the word guardianship, the mail redirected without my knowledge, the dinner with Roger Callum and the leather portfolio, the letter of intent, 40% under fair market value, routed through a trust I'd never authorized, the guardianship petition already drafted citing vascular dementia I did not have, the physician's declaration signed by a Dr. Franklin Voss, describing a home visit that never occurred. Doc Sully's face went very still and very hard partway through my telling. "Franklin Voss," he said when I finished. "I know that name. Lost his license to practice independently 4 years ago after a state board investigation. Something to do with signing disability paperwork for patients he'd never actually examined for a fee, kept a consulting license, does independent evaluations now, mostly for insurance companies, and apparently for anyone willing to pay for a diagnosis instead of earn one. You're telling me my son and Roger Callum found a doctor whose whole business is selling fake diagnoses, I said. I'm telling you that's the most likely explanation for a home visit that never happened producing a specific technical diagnosis like vascular dementia, Doc Sully said. That's not a lucky guess. That's a man filling in a form he's filled in 100 times before. Marcus Cho set down his pen. Mr. Voss, I need you to understand the mechanics of what's being attempted here, because I think it'll help you understand exactly how to fight it. A guardianship petition, especially an emergency temporary one, moves fast and it moves on paper. If your son files that petition with the physician's declaration attached, a judge is going to look at a sworn medical document describing cognitive decline, and unless someone contests it immediately, with equal or better documentation, the judge may well grant temporary authority within days, sometimes within hours if the petition alleges urgent risk to the person or their assets. Once that temporary guardianship is in place, your son, or whoever the petition names, could have the legal authority to sign that letter of intent on the land himself on your behalf before a full hearing ever happens. I felt something cold settle into my stomach. How fast are we talking? If they file this week, Marcus said, a hearing on emergency temporary authority could happen within 72 hours of filing. And Mr. Voss, I'd put real money on them filing soon, because that letter of intent you photographed, the one routed through this Voss Family Legacy Trust, did it name a closing date? I pulled out my phone, scrolled to the photograph, and read the date aloud. 11 days from that evening, Ray Odom let out a low whistle. That's not a coincidence. That's a construction loan deadline dressed up as a real estate closing. Roger Callum's over-leveraged, has been for a couple years now. Word around this town is Callum Coastal's been carrying some bad debt since that resort deal down in Beaufort went sideways. He needs collateral, and he needs it fast. And 11 acres of unencumbered waterfront with your name on the deed is about the cleanest collateral in this county. So what do? I said, and I heard, for the first time in 8 days of careful performance, my own voice cracked slightly with something that wasn't an act. Marcus Cho leaned forward. First, we do not let them know you know. That instinct you've had since the hospital, playing along, letting them believe you're declining. That instinct is the single smartest thing you've done in this whole ordeal, and we are going to keep doing it because the moment they know you're onto them, they will stop being sloppy, and sloppy is the only reason we currently have a chance. Second, Doc Sully said, I want to independently evaluate you, properly, full cognitive workup, done by a physician with an unimpeachable record, documented, dated, ready to submit the instant anyone tries to use that Franklin Voss declaration against you. I can do it myself, or I can refer you to a colleague if you'd rather have someone with no personal relationship to you, for the sake of appearances. Do it yourself, I said. I trust you. Third, Marcus continued, I want copies of everything. The letter of intent, the trust document, the guardianship petition, the physician's declaration, all of it in a secure location. And I want to start quietly researching this Voss Family Legacy Trust, because a trust doesn't create itself. Someone had to file articles of organization, and I'd bet my law license that trail leads somewhere interesting. And fourth, Ray Odom said, cracking his knuckles in a gesture I remembered from 40 years of watching him settle bar fights without throwing a punch, I want to know everything about Roger Callum's finances that a retired cop with a lot of friends still on the force and at the county recorder's office can find out without breaking a single law, because a man who's this desperate to hit a closing date in 11 days is a man who's already made mistakes somewhere, and desperate men leave trails. I looked around that booth at 3 people who owed me nothing, who had no legal or financial stake in what happened to my 11 acres of waterfront, and I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time since I'd heard my son say the word guardianship through a hospital wall. Why are you all doing this? I asked, and I meant it honestly, not as false modesty. Doc Sully answered first. Because I've watched it happen to a dozen patients over 30 years, Harlan, and I've never once had the chance to stop it before the family finished the job. This time I do. Ray Odom answered second. Because Colleen sat with my wife every single week for 2 years while she was dying, and never once asked for a thing in return, and I have been waiting 11 years for a way to pay that back. And Marcus Cho, who I had known for exactly 40 minutes, said the thing that stayed with me longest. Because my niece called me tonight and told me about a man who thanked a nurse for a bag of bread instead of asking her for anything else. And in my experience, Mr. Voss, that tells you more about a person's character than 30 years of legal filings ever could. We stayed in that booth until nearly 10 that night, mapping out a plan, and Angela drove me back to Derek and Vanessa's house at exactly the 2-hour mark she'd promised, and I walked in the front door wearing the tired, grateful, faintly bewildered face of an old man who'd had a nice visit with his nurse. And Vanessa asked how I was feeling, and I said, truthfully for once, that I felt a little more like myself. Over the next 4 days, the evidence arrived the way flooding arrives, slow at first, then all at once. Doc Sully evaluated me on a Thursday morning in his own home office with a formal written report that documented, in careful clinical language, a mind entirely intact, entirely oriented, entirely capable of managing my own affairs, dated and signed and notarized within 48 hours of the Franklin Voss declaration Roger Callum's attorneys had drafted. Marcus Cho found the Voss Family Legacy Trust, filing at the county recorder's office, articles of organization filed 9 days after my heart attack, listing Derek Voss as sole trustee, prepared by an attorney named Preston Marchetti, the very name I'd heard Derek say through the hospital wall that first terrible night. Marchetti, it turned out, was not simply an attorney handling paperwork. He was general counsel for Callum Coastal Group on Roger Callum's payroll, which meant the man drafting the legal instrument that would strip me of my property rights was employed full-time by the man who stood to profit from that exact outcome. Ray Odom's old contacts turned up something even uglier. Callum Coastal Group had defaulted on interest payments to a Charlotte-based lending group twice in the last 18 months, and the resort project down in Beaufort that Ray had mentioned had, in fact, collapsed entirely 6 months earlier, leaving Roger Callum personally guaranteed on nearly $4 million in construction debt that his own company's assets could no longer cover. My 11 acres of unencumbered waterfront, valued conservatively at $3.5 million, was not a business opportunity for Roger Callum. It was a lifeline for a man drowning in his own bad bets, and my son had married into that drowning family and had chosen, when the moment came, to help pull his father-in-law up by pushing me under. I sat with all of that evidence spread across Doc Sully's kitchen table on a Sunday evening, 5 days before the closing date named in the letter of intent, and I felt something that surprised me. Not triumph, grief. I had spent 5 decades believing that the family I'd built with Colleen, the son we'd raised together in that ironworks in that little house on the water, was the one thing in my life that would outlast me the way the bridge would, solid and load-bearing and true. I was looking now at proof, page after notarized page of it, that the load-bearing wall of my life had rot in it I'd never once suspected, and the discovery of rot, even rot you're grateful to find before the whole structure collapses, still hurts the way a wound hurts, clean and deep and undeniable. You don't have to decide tonight how you feel about your son, Doc Sully said quietly, watching my face. You just have to decide what you're going to do about the next 5 days. I thought about the bridge. I thought about how you don't repair a failing structure by pretending the failure isn't there, and you don't repair it either by tearing the whole thing down out of spite. You find the exact point of weakness, and you reinforce it, or you cut it out clean and replace it, and you do the work in the right order, at the right time, with people who know what they're doing standing beside you. I want one more conversation with him first, I said, alone. Before any of this becomes public, I owe him that much even now. Marcus Cho, who had said very little that evening, finally spoke. That's not just decent, Mr. Voss, it's strategically sound. If this ends up in front of a judge, and I believe it will, a record showing you gave your son a direct, private chance to come clean before any public exposure will matter. It shows restraint. It shows you weren't hunting for a fight. Courts notice that. I called Derek the next morning and asked him to meet me alone at the ironworks that afternoon. Told him I wanted to show him something in my father's old office. And I watched his face when he arrived. A face doing careful, hopeful math, probably wondering if his confused old father wanted to talk about leaving him the shop in a will, unaware that the will in question had already been quietly rewritten 3 days earlier in Marcus Cho's office. With Doc Sully and Ray Odom as witnesses, I sat him down at the old desk in the office where I'd found Colleen's compass 12 days earlier, and I laid the photographs out in front of him one at a time. The letter of intent, the trust document with his name on it as sole trustee, the guardianship petition citing vascular dementia, the physician's declaration signed by a man who'd lost his medical license for exactly this kind of fraud, describing a home visit that had never taken place. I watched the color drain out of my son's face, watched him look at the evidence of his own signature on documents built on a lie, and I said the only thing I had left to say to him in that moment, quiet and true and final. I heard you through the hospital wall, Derek, the night of my heart attack. I heard you tell Roger you needed a week to ease me into the guardianship conversation. I have known every single day since then, and I let all of you believe I was losing my mind, because I needed the time to find out exactly how far you'd go. Derek did not deny it. I will give him that much credit, in a story that will not give him much more. He put his face in his hands at that old desk and he said, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since he was 19 and had wrecked his first truck and had to tell me and Colleen together, Dad, I didn't want to do it this way. Roger said it was the only way to hit the closing. He said you'd understand once it was done, he said. He said, I repeated, and something in my voice must have carried the whole weight of 11 years of loneliness and 43 years of building things meant to last. Because Derek flinched like I'd struck him. You are 44 years old, son. You do not need Roger Callum's permission to know right from wrong. You knew. You knew the moment you let Dr. Reyes's name get quietly swapped out for a man who sells diagnoses. You knew when you let a stranger's attorney draft a trust document with your name on it and mine nowhere on the paperwork that mattered. You knew and you did it anyway, because it was easier than telling your father-in-law no. He was crying by then, and some small tired part of me, the part that had carried him on my shoulders at the county fair and taught him to strike an arc weld without blinding himself, wanted badly to reach across that desk and comfort him. I did not. I have thought about that moment many times since, and I still believe it was the hardest and the most necessary thing I did in this entire ordeal, harder even than what came after in public. Loving someone and rescuing them from the consequences of betraying you are not the same act, and conflating them is how families like mine end up broken twice over instead of healed once properly, the slow and honest way. I'm not signing that letter of intent, I told him, and I'm not going to be declared incompetent by a doctor who's never laid eyes on me, based on a diagnosis I don't have. I have my own evaluation now, Derek, from a physician with 30 years of unimpeachable practice, dated and notarized, that says exactly what you already know is true. There is nothing wrong with my mind. There never was. Dad, please, he said. If we don't hit the closing, Roger's going to lose everything. Vanessa's whole family. It's not just him. That is not my burden to carry, I said, and I said it gently, because some truths land harder when they're spoken softly. I did not create Roger Callum's debt. I did not make his risky bets on a resort in Beaufort. You are asking me to hand over 11 acres my father poured with his own 2 hands, 40% under fair value, through a trust I never authorized, based on a lie about my own mind, so that your wife's family can avoid the consequences of their own choices. I will not do that, Derek. Not for you. Not for anyone. He left the ironworks that afternoon without another word, and I sat alone in my father's office for a long time afterward, holding the compass, thinking about the particular loneliness of having given your son every chance to choose you and watching him, one last time, walk out the door instead. I did not know, sitting there, that Derek would drive straight to Roger Callum's office, and that the conversation that followed would set in motion the second public act of this story, the one that would end. 5 days later, under the lights of a groundbreaking ceremony with 200 witnesses and a recording device I did not put there myself. Derek told Roger Callum everything. I know this because Ray Odom's contacts confirmed it within a day, a hurried, panicked meeting at Callum Coastal Group's office that ran nearly 2 hours, followed by a flurry of calls between Roger, Preston Marsh Cady, and most tellingly, Dr. Franklin Voss, whose consulting practice, it turned out, kept remarkably pwned records for a man being paid. According to a wire transfer, Marcus Cho's contacts at the bank were able to subpoena within days once the fraud became provable, $18,000 for a cognitive assessment of a patient he had never once examined in person. I expected, once Derek knew, that the guardianship petition would quietly disappear, that Roger Callum would cut his losses and look elsewhere for his collateral. I underestimated him. A man $4 million underwater and 11 days from a construction loan default does not behave like a man with options. He behaves like a man who has already decided the only way out is straight through. And Roger Callum, I learned over the following 48 hours, had decided that the only way through was to move faster, not slower. He filed the guardianship petition anyway. 2 days after my conversation with Derek, Marcus Cho received notice through his own contacts at the courthouse, a professional courtesy from a clerk who'd worked with him for decades, that a petition had been filed requesting emergency temporary guardianship over the person and estate of Harlan Voss, citing the physician's declaration of Dr. Franklin Voss, and requesting an expedited hearing given urgent risk of the ward's assets being dissipated or transferred without appropriate protection. The urgent risk, I want you to understand, was that I might sell or otherwise protect my own land before Roger Callum's company could acquire it below market value. They had filed a petition to protect me from myself, using my own property as the thing they claimed needed protecting, while simultaneously trying to acquire that same property for 40% under its value. I have built things my whole life that had to bear real, physical weight, and I have never in 43 years seen a structure of lies engineered with quite that much shameless, load-bearing audacity. Marcus Cho filed our response within 24 hours. Doc Sully's full cognitive evaluation, dated and notarized before the petition was even filed, a formal complaint against Dr. Franklin Voss with the State Medical Board, and a motion requesting the guardianship hearing be consolidated with an emergency hearing on elder financial exploitation, given the evidence, already gathered, of a forged home visit, an undervalued sale routed through an unauthorized trust, and a documented pattern of concealment beginning the night of my hospitalization. The judge assigned to the case, a woman named the Honorable Patricia Renfro, who Ray Odom informed me had presided over exactly the kind of elder exploitation case Marcus Cho was now alleging on more than one prior occasion, scheduled a hearing for the following Thursday, 4 days out. Roger Callum's closing date, the one I'd photographed in that leather portfolio 11 days earlier, fell on Friday. 1 day after, that was when Roger Callum, desperate and cornered, and apparently convinced that the momentum of publicity could still save him, made the mistake that ended him. He announced a groundbreaking ceremony. I learned about it from Vanessa. Of all people, 3 days before it was set to happen, still living under the roof of a house I no longer trusted, still performing the role of a bewildered old man who'd had a nice calming visit with his son a week earlier, and hadn't asked many questions since. She told me, with the bright, forced cheerfulness she'd worn like a costume for 2 weeks, that her father was hosting a community celebration on Thursday evening, right on the waterfront, to announce the future of the Ellison Marina residences, and that Derek thought it would be good for me to attend, to see the exciting things happening, to feel included in the family's next chapter. I understood immediately what Roger Callum was actually doing. He could not close on land he did not yet legally control, not with a guardianship hearing scheduled and my own attorney contesting every document he'd built his claim on. But he could announce, publicly, before 200 townspeople, county officials, a reporter from the local paper, and every investor he'd courted for 18 months, that the Ellison Marina Residences project was moving forward, backed, he intended to claim, by the full cooperation of the Voss family. He needed the appearance of momentum badly enough to manufacture it in public, one day before a judge could tell him, in private, that he had none, and the ceremony was scheduled for Thursday evening, the same day as the guardianship hearing, timed, I was certain, to happen immediately after, so that regardless of what the judge ruled that afternoon, Roger Callum could stand in front of the whole town that same evening and announce a done deal before anyone outside the courtroom had time to learn otherwise. I sat in Marcus Cho's office 2 days before the hearing, and I told him and Ray Odom and Doc Sully and Angela Cho, all 5 of us crowded around a legal pad covered in Marcus's careful handwriting, that I did not want this to end quietly in a courtroom with a sealed record and a settlement neither side spoke of again. He put a fake diagnosis in front of a judge to try to take my mind away from me on paper, I said. He tried to buy my father's life's work for 40 cents on the dollar using a lie a broke, unlicensed doctor sold him for $18,000. He did all of that quietly, behind closed doors, betting that an old man wouldn't notice and a family wouldn't fight. I want the town to see exactly what he tried to do, in the same public square he was planning to use to celebrate it. Ray Odom smiled the particular smile I remembered from 40 years of watching him defuse bar fights, right before he didn't have to throw a punch, because the other man had already lost. I know some folks at the paper, he said, and I've got 2 guys from my old precinct who'd love an excuse to be present at a public event where a documented fraud might come to light. Doc Sully had already filed his formal complaint with the state medical board, a copy of which, timed carefully, would become public record the very morning of the ceremony. Marcus Cho had one more piece to add. The judge is going to hear this case Thursday afternoon. I intend to request the ruling be issued from the bench that same day, not held under advisement, given the urgency Roger Callum's own petition alleged. If Judge Renfrew rules the way I believe she will, we will have a signed order, in hand, dismissing the guardianship petition and formally finding Harlan competent, hours before that groundbreaking ceremony begins. And if I bring that order with me to the ceremony, I said, understanding now the shape of the last public act of this story, and stand in front of 200 people while Roger Callum tells them a lie I can disprove with a single sheet of paper. Then he built his own trap, Harlan, Doc Sully said quietly. You're just the one who's going to be standing there when it closes. Thursday came in gray and windy off the Sound, the kind of weather that used to mean good fishing, and now, I understood, was going to mean something else entirely. The guardianship hearing lasted just under 2 hours. I sat beside Marcus Cho at a long wooden table in a courtroom I had not set foot in since serving jury duty decades earlier, and I watched Preston Marchetti argue, with a straight face I found almost admirable in its shamelessness, that the physician's declaration represented sound clinical judgment, and that any procedural irregularities were immaterial to the underlying medical findings. Judge Renfrew did not agree. She read Doc Sully's evaluation into the record. She read the state medical board complaint into the record. She asked directly whether Dr. Franklin Voss had ever, at any point, physically examined me, and when Marchetti could produce no evidence that he had, her expression settled into something I recognized from 40 years of watching my own foreman respond to shoddy work. The particular, controlled fury of a professional confronted with someone else's contempt for the standards of their trade. She dismissed the guardianship petition from the bench. She found, formally and on the record, that I retained full legal capacity over my person and my estate. She referred the physician's declaration to the state's attorney for potential criminal review, and she noted, in language Marcus Cho later told me he would frame and hang in his office, that the court took an exceptionally dim view of any party who would attempt to use a fabricated medical diagnosis to seize an elderly citizen's property during his recovery from a genuine cardiac event. We had the signed order in hand by 4:30 that afternoon. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for 6. I did not tell Derek or Vanessa I intended to come. I let them believe, right up until the final hour, that I was too tired from the day, that I'd stay home and rest, the last small performance of a story built almost entirely out of performance. Angela Cho drove me to the waterfront at 5:15, and Ray Odom met us there with two off-duty officers he'd known for 20 years, standing quietly near the back of the gathering crowd, not there to arrest anyone yet, simply there to make certain nothing got out of hand once the truth arrived. The ceremony was held on a stretch of grass overlooking my father's ironworks, close enough that I could see the old ship's bell from where I stood at the edge of the crowd. A podium set up with a Callum Coastal Group banner behind it. A small crowd of investors and county officials and curious residents drawn by free barbecue and the promise of the town's newest development. Roger Callum stood at that podium in a blazer, the color of good news. Derek and Vanessa seated in folding chairs in the front row, and I watched my son scan the crowd once, twice, looking, I understood later, for me, hoping I'd stayed home, hoping this could happen without me standing there to see it. Roger began his remarks the way men like him always do, with gratitude, with vision, with the particular warm confidence of a man who has never once had to watch a deal fall apart in public. He spoke of the town's future, of jobs, of a marina that would bring prosperity to a stretch of waterfront that had, he said, served this community faithfully for generations, and is now ready, with the full support of the Voss family, to serve it in an exciting new way. I walked forward through the crowd. At that exact moment, the signed order from Judge Renfro folded in my breast pocket, beside a compass that had ridden there for 2 weeks, and the crowd parted around me the way crowds do for an old man moving with clear purpose. And I stopped at the edge of the podium, close enough that Roger Callum's easy smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he recovered it. "Harlan," he said, warm and public and utterly unbothered, "so glad you could make it. We were just talking about your family's incredible legacy." "We were," I said, and my voice carried, the way a voice carries when a shop foreman has spent 40 years learning to be heard over machinery. "So let's talk about it properly, in front of everyone, since you've gone to the trouble of gathering them." I pulled the folded order from my pocket. I held it up, not shouting, not performing anger, simply speaking the plain, load-bearing truth the way I'd learned to speak about a weld that had failed. 3 hours ago, a judge in this county dismissed a petition filed by my own son at the request of the man standing at this podium, asking the court to declare me legally incompetent. That petition was built on a medical diagnosis I do not have, signed by a physician who never once examined me, a physician the state medical board is now investigating for selling fraudulent diagnoses to families who want an old man's land more than they want his well-being. The crowd's murmur rose behind me, phones lifting, a local reporter I recognized from the front row already writing fast. Roger Callum's smile had gone entirely, replaced by the flat, calculating look of a man doing rapid math on how much damage he could contain. "This is a private family matter," he said, low, urgent, stepping closer to the microphone as though proximity could shrink the crowd's attention. "Harlan, I think we should. You made it public, Roger," I said. "You put a banner behind you and free food in front of 150 of my neighbors so you could announce a done deal on land you do not own, land I have never sold, land my father poured with his own hands in 1962, while men like your father were still deciding whether this town was worth investing in at all. I am not going to let you make that announcement while a signed court order sits in my pocket saying every word of it is a lie." I held the order up higher, and Marcus Cho, who had come to stand beside me without my noticing, stepped forward to confirm, for the reporter and for the county official present, and for anyone else who wanted to verify it, that the document was genuine, that the court's ruling was a matter of public record as of that afternoon, and that a formal complaint regarding the underlying fraud had already been referred for criminal review. Roger Callum did the thing desperate. Cornered men do. The thing I had learned, over 2 weeks of quiet investigation, was the one constant across every fraud like his. He stopped protecting the people he'd used and started protecting only himself. "This was your son's plan," he said, turning to the crowd, to the reporter, abandoning Derek in real time in front of 200 witnesses the exact way he'd been willing to abandon my competency on paper. Derek came to me. He said his father was declining. He was worried about the estate. He asked me to help structure something protective. "Dad," That's not. Derek was on his feet now, his face white, Vanessa's hand gripping his arm, and I watched my son, for one brief moment, look at his father-in-law with an expression I recognized, because I'd worn it myself 2 weeks earlier, lying in a hospital bed listening through a wall. The particular vertigo of realizing the person you trusted most had already decided you were expendable. He forged the doctor, Ray Odom said, stepping forward now. Badge retired, but voice still carrying the flat authority of 31 years on the force, loud enough for the whole gathering to hear. Franklin Voss got paid $18,000, wired from Callum Coastal Group's operating account, for a home visit that never happened. That's not a family being protective, Roger. That's elder financial exploitation, and it's a felony in this state. The two off-duty officers Ray had brought were no longer standing quietly at the back of the crowd. I watched them move forward, unhurried, professional, and I watched Roger Callum's face understand, in real time, in front of the reporter whose photograph would run on the front page of the Ellison Gazette the following morning, that the groundbreaking ceremony he had built to manufacture public momentum had instead become the exact venue where his fraud finished collapsing in public. He was not arrested that evening, not in handcuffs on the spot. That particular satisfaction the story doesn't quite give me, but the criminal referral Judge Renfro had ordered from the bench that afternoon moved quickly. Once the state's attorney's office saw the wire transfer records Marcus Cho had already subpoenaed. And 11 weeks later, Roger Callum pleaded guilty to attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult and 1 count of wire fraud connected to the payment to Dr. Franklin Voss, whose consulting license was permanently revoked by the state medical board that same season. Roger Callum served 14 months. Callum Coastal Group dissolved under the weight of the debt that had driven him to try to take my land in the first place, and I understood, watching all of it unfold slowly over the following year, that greed rarely needs an ending imposed on it from outside. It usually just finishes collapsing under its own unpaid weight, once nobody's left to prop it up any longer. Derek did not go to prison. Marcus Cho advised, and I ultimately agreed, that pursuing criminal charges against my own son, who had not forged anything himself, who had been a willing and cowardly participant rather than the architect, would serve no purpose except to finish destroying a family that had already been badly wounded. I did not forgive him that evening, standing on that grass with a signed order in my hand and the ship's bell visible over his shoulder. Forgiveness, I have learned at 71, is not a single sentence spoken in a moment of triumph. It is a slow, repeated thing, built the same way you build anything meant to hold weight, one honest layer at a time, tested under load before you trust it with anything important. What I did that evening, once the crowd had thinned and the reporter had gotten her quotes, and Roger Callum had been led, quietly, toward a waiting car, was walk over to where Derek still sat, frozen, in his folding chair, Vanessa beside him with her face in her hands. I'm not doing this for revenge, I told him. I want you to understand that, because I think you're braced for me to say something crueler. I'm doing this because your grandfather built a business on the idea that a thing done honestly lasts, and a thing done dishonestly, no matter how carefully you dress it up, eventually fails under its own weight. You chose the dishonest thing, Derek, and I need you to sit with what that cost, all the way down, before I'm willing to build anything new with you. What happens now? He asked, and his voice sounded, for the first time in 2 weeks, entirely without performance, just a frightened man looking at the wreckage of his own choices. Now, I said, I'm going to do something with that land that neither Roger Callum nor a court-appointed guardian was ever going to let me do, and you're welcome to be part of it if you're willing to actually earn your way back rather than being handed it. I want to tell you what I built, because I think it matters more than the punishment did. 6 weeks after that groundbreaking ceremony that ended so differently than Roger Callum had planned, I sat down with Marcus Cho and rewrote my estate plan entirely. The version we'd quietly drafted during those first frantic days had been a defensive measure, protecting the land from exactly the kind of fraud that had nearly taken it. This new version was something else, something built forward rather than merely defended. The 11 acres became the Colleen Voss Maritime Trust, named for my wife, its charter permanent and irrevocable. The ironworks itself reopened, not as a private business, but as a working apprenticeship program, welding, fabrication, marine repair, teaching trades to young people in this county who couldn't afford 4 years of college and deserved a path to a stable, skilled life exactly the way my father had once given that path to me. The bridge plaque with my name stayed exactly where it was, but a second plaque went up beside it, 18 months later, listing the first graduating class of 11 apprentices, a number I chose deliberately, one for every acre. Derek did not receive a golden inheritance. He received instead an offer, a paid position at the ironworks, not as an owner, not as a trustee, but as the trust's operations coordinator, answerable to a board that included Doc Sully, Ray Odom, and at her own insistence, Angela Cho, who had by then become close enough to our family that I no longer thought of her as anything other than the daughter Colleen and I had never had. Derek took the job. He is, as of the writing of this story, 11 months into proving himself in a role with real, measurable accountability for the first time in his adult life. And I will tell you honestly, I don't know yet how that story ends. Some structures take years to test properly under load before you know if they'll hold. Vanessa and Derek separated 4 months after the ceremony. I won't pretend to know everything that happened inside that marriage, and it isn't my story to tell in detail, but I will say this much. A marriage built partly on the comfortable assumption of her family's money rarely survives that money's collapse cleanly, and I don't think either of them entirely mourns what ended once the dust settled. As for me, I still walk out to the ironworks most mornings, though my hands don't hold a torch steady the way they used to. And I mostly watch now, and teach, and occasionally ring that old ship's bell at the end of a good day's training, the way my father used to. I carry Colleen's compass in my shirt pocket still, every day, and some mornings, standing under that bell, with a new crop of apprentices, sparking metal into the shape of something useful, I think about the particular gift buried inside the worst night of my life, the night my son left me alone in a hospital bed to attend someone else's party. It cost me nearly everything I thought I could trust, but it also taught me, in the clearest terms a man can be taught anything, exactly who shows up when it matters, and exactly what a family actually is. Once you strip away the assumption that blood alone earns it, we spend so much of our lives assuming the people who share our name will also share our loyalty, and we're often wrong, and we spend far too little time noticing the people who show up anyway, with no obligation at all, a bag of sourdough bread, a retired badge, a legal pad full of careful notes, simply because it was the right thing to do. Legacy isn't a deed or a bank account. It's who chooses to stand beside you once the easy reasons for loyalty have all burned away. Thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it meant something to you, if you've ever had to learn the hard way exactly who your real family is, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments. If you were in my position, would you have let your son back in at all, or would you have closed that door for good? I read every comment, and tonight I mean that more than usual. This is Harlan Voss, signing off.